It was a quiet evening in the small town of Maplewood. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple before fading into darkness. The streets were calm, almost eerily so, as Officer Mark Reynolds drove his patrol car down Main Street. He liked this time of day. It was peaceful, and most people were either at home or settling in for the night. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the stillness in the air, or perhaps it was just his instincts kicking in. As he turned onto 4th Avenue, his headlights caught a flicker of movement on the sidewalk ahead. At first glance, it looked like a shadow. But then he saw her, a young girl walking unsteadily, swaying from side to side as though she couldn't keep her balance. His heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Mark slowed the car and rolled down his window, calling out gently, "Hey, are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she stumbled forward a few more steps before collapsing onto the pavement. Without hesitation, Mark parked the car, flipped on his hazard lights, and rushed to her side. When he knelt beside her, he could see how pale she was. Her skin was clammy and her breathing was shallow. She looked frail, almost too fragile for someone her age. Mark's training kicked in immediately. He checked her pulse. It was weak but steady, and called for an ambulance. While waiting, he took a closer look at her. That's when he noticed the bruises. They weren't fresh, but they were unmistakable. Small, circular marks along her arms, some slightly darker than others. And her clothes. They were torn in places, not enough to seem accidental, but not dramatic enough to scream distress either. It was subtle, yet it gnawed at him. Who was this girl? What had happened to her? The paramedics arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the silence of the night. They loaded her onto a stretcher, securing her carefully before rushing her into the ambulance. Mark followed behind in his squad car, unable to shake off the feeling that this wasn't just another routine emergency. There was something deeper here, something hidden beneath the surface. At the hospital, the staff sprang into action, wheeling the girl straight into the emergency room. Mark stood outside, watching through the glass doors as doctors and nurses worked tirelessly around her. He wanted answers, but all he had were questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why did she collapse? And what about those bruises? He leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. This case already felt personal. Maybe it was because he had a daughter close to her age. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he knew this wasn't going to be simple. Whatever it was, Mark vowed to stay involved until every piece of the puzzle fell into place. Inside the ER, Dr. Emily Carter was finishing up a long shift when the call came in. Another patient, another late-night emergency. She sighed, bracing herself for whatever awaited her. When the stretcher rolled in, she froze for a moment. The girl lying there looked so young, so vulnerable. Her face was ghostly pale, and her body seemed impossibly thin under the harsh fluorescent lights. Emily snapped back to reality, barking orders to her team. "Get IV fluids started. Monitor her vitals closely," she instructed. As they worked, Emily couldn't help but notice something unusual about the girl's appearance. There were faint marks on her wrists, strange, almost symmetrical patterns that didn't look like typical injuries. They seemed deliberate, yet oddly concealed. Her curiosity grew as she examined the girl further. The torn clothing raised more red flags. Was this self-inflicted? An accident? Abuse? Emily pushed the thoughts aside for now, focusing instead on stabilizing her patient. But even as she moved efficiently from task to task, one question lingered. In her mind, what exactly had brought this girl here? Once the immediate danger passed, Emily stepped back to review the preliminary findings. The girl's condition suggested extreme exhaustion, malnutrition, and possible dehydration. Yet something about her symptoms didn't add up. It was as if her body was fighting against something invisible, something undetectable without further investigation. As Emily waited for test results, she glanced at the clock. It was past midnight now, and the hospital corridors were eerily quiet. Outside, Officer Reynolds paced nervously, his phone pressed to his ear as he updated dispatch. Through the glass, Emily caught sight of him and felt a pang of sympathy. Whoever this girl was, she clearly meant something to him, even if he didn't know her name yet. Back inside the ER, machines beeped steadily, monitoring the girl's heartbeat and oxygen levels. Emily pulled up a chair beside her bed, studying, her face intently. She looked younger up close, no older than 16 or 17. Her dark hair framed her delicate features, and her lips were slightly parted as she breathed unevenly. Who was she? What secrets did she carry? And why had fate brought her crashing into Officer Reynolds' path on this particular night? Emily didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Unraveling this mystery would take patience, persistence, and maybe even a little luck. For now, all they could do was wait. For the girl to wake up, for the lab reports to come back, and for the truth to reveal itself. But one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be an ordinary case. Not by a long shot. The hospital was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes against the tiled floor. Dr. Emily Carter sat at her desk in the corner of the emergency room, poring over the girl's initial test results. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The blood work had revealed something unusual, traces of a chemical compound that didn't belong in a human body. It wasn't toxic in small amounts, but its presence was alarming nonetheless. Emily leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She had been working long hours, and fatigue was starting to creep in. But this case refused to let her rest. What was this chemical? How had it ended up in the girl's system? And most importantly, why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement from the bed nearby. The girl stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open for the first time since arriving at the hospital. Emily quickly rose from her seat and approached her, speaking softly to avoid startling her. "Hi there," Emily said gently, offering a warm smile. "You're in the hospital. My name is Dr. Carter. Can you tell me your name?" The girl blinked a few times, confusion clouding her features. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, as though unsure whether she should answer. Finally, she whispered, "Sarah." "Okay, Sarah," Emily replied, jotting down the name on her clipboard. "Do you remember what happened? Do you know why you passed out?" Sarah shook her head weakly, tears welling up in her eyes. She looked away, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Emily could see the fear in her expression, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly. Something or someone had scared her deeply. "It's okay," Emily reassured her. "You're safe here, just take your time." For several minutes, Sarah remained silent, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers herself. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I don't know. I just felt dizzy, and then everything went black." Emily nodded, making a mental note of her response. She decided not to push too hard. Not yet. Instead, she asked simpler questions, ones that might help piece together Sarah's story without overwhelming her. "How old are you, Sarah?" 17, came the muffled reply. "And where do you live?" This time, Sarah hesitated longer. Her gaze dropped to her lap, and she bit her lip nervously. I'm not sure I should say." Emily frowned but kept her tone calm and reassuring. "It's important we get in touch with your family. They must be worried about you." At the mention of family, Sarah flinched visibly. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, and she shook her head again. "No, please, and don't call them." Something about her reaction sent a chill down Emily's spine. This wasn't just teenage rebellion or stubbornness, it was fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. Whatever secrets Sarah carried, they weighed heavily on her. Outside the ER, Officer Mark Reynolds paced anxiously. He had called dispatch earlier, reporting the incident and requesting assistance with identifying the girl. So far, no matches had turned up in missing persons databases, which only added to his frustration. Who was she? Why did she seem so reluctant to share information? And what about those bruises he'd noticed earlier? Mark glanced through the glass doors, watching as Dr. Carter spoke with the girl. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he could tell it wasn't easy. The girl, Sarah, if he remembered correctly, looked tense, almost defensive. Every instinct in his body told him this wasn't just a random medical emergency. There was more to this story, and he intended to find out what it was. Back inside, Emily decided to change tactics. Instead of pressing Sarah for details about her home life, she focused on building trust. She pulled up a chair beside the bed and sat down, keeping her posture relaxed and non-threatening. "You've been through a lot tonight," Emily began, her voice soft and steady. "But I want you to know that you can talk to me. Whatever it is, I'll do my best to help." Sarah glanced at her briefly, then looked away again. For a moment, Emily thought she wouldn't respond. But then, in a hesitant voice, Sarah admitted, "I've been working at a factory." "A factory?" Emily repeated, surprised. "What kind of factory?" "I don't know the name," Sarah murmured. "They hired me over the summer. Said I could earn extra money." Emily's heart sank. Child labor laws were strict, especially for minors like Sarah. If she was telling the truth, and Emily had no reason to doubt her, then this raised serious concerns. Not only was Sarah underage, but factories often exposed workers to hazardous conditions. Could her exposure to the mysterious chemical be linked to her job? Before Emily could ask more, Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "They made us work long hours, sometimes without breaks, and the air, it smelled funny, like chemicals." Emily's mind raced. Could the chemical traces in Sarah's blood have come from prolonged exposure at the factory? If so, how many other workers might be affected? Was this an isolated incident, or part of a larger problem? She reached out and placed a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. "Thank you for telling me this. We'll figure things out together, okay? Right now, your health is the priority." Sarah nodded faintly, though her eyes still reflected uncertainty. Emily knew she needed to tread carefully. Pushing too hard might cause Sarah to shut down completely, and they couldn't afford to lose her cooperation, not when so much depended on uncovering the truth. Meanwhile, outside the ER, Mark received a call from dispatch. They had cross-referenced Sarah's description with local employment records and found a match. A small manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town had recently hired temporary workers, including several teenagers. The timing lined up perfectly. Mark's jaw tightened as he processed the information. If Sarah's symptoms were connected to her work environment, then this wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was potentially criminal negligence. He resolved to visit the factory himself, posing as part of a routine safety inspection. He needed to see firsthand what conditions these kids were being subjected to. As dawn broke over Maplewood, Emily returned to her desk, exhausted but determined. She reviewed Sarah's file once more, noting every detail, the chemical traces, the bruises, the torn clothing, and now the factory connection. Each piece of evidence pointed to a disturbing conclusion. Sarah's collapse wasn't an accident. It was the result of systemic exploitation and neglect. For Sarah, lying awake in her hospital bed, the night felt endless. Despite Emily's reassurances, she couldn't shake the feeling that danger lurked just beyond the hospital walls. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder. She clutched the blanket tighter, praying silently that she had made the right decision by speaking up. Little did she know, her bravery was about to set off a chain reaction, one that would expose truths hidden in plain sight and ignite a fight for justice that would ripple far beyond her own life. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting soft golden light across the room where Sarah lay. Her breathing had steadied, and her complexion was less pale than it had been the night before. But despite her physical improvement, she remained withdrawn, her eyes darting nervously whenever someone entered the room. Dr. Emily Carter watched her carefully, sensing that Sarah's fears ran deeper than just exhaustion or illness. Emily sat beside her bed again, holding a cup of coffee to ward off her own fatigue. She knew they were running out of time. Whatever had caused Sarah's collapse wasn't going away on its own, and if her condition worsened, the consequences could be dire. Determined to uncover more, Emily decided to dig deeper into the mysterious chemical compound found in Sarah's blood. She reached out to Dr. Michael Hayes, an environmental health expert at a nearby university. After explaining the situation, over the phone, she sent him the lab results for analysis. "This isn't something we typically see in routine cases," Emily said, her voice tinged with urgency. "I need to know what it is and how dangerous it might be." Dr. Hayes promised to review the data immediately and get back to her as soon as possible. In the meantime, Emily turned her attention back to Sarah. The girl had mentioned working at a factory, but details were scarce. Emily needed to understand exactly what kind of environment Sarah had been exposed to, and whether others might also be at risk. Officer Mark Reynolds arrived at the hospital early that morning, his mind racing with questions. Dispatch had provided him with the address of the factory where Sarah claimed to have worked. He knew visiting the site would give him answers, but he couldn't shake the unease growing in his gut. If Sarah's story checked out, this wasn't just a matter of unsafe working conditions, it was exploitation, plain and simple. Mark parked his squad car a block away from the factory and approached on foot, pretending to be an inspector conducting routine checks. As he stepped inside, the smell hit him first, a sharp, acrid odor that burned his nostrils. It reminded him of cleaning supplies mixed with something metallic, though he couldn't quite place it. Workers moved around him, their faces masked by exhaustion rather than protective gear. He introduced himself to the foreman, flashing his badge briefly before slipping into character. "Just doing a quick walkthrough," he said casually, "making sure everything's up to code." The foreman nodded stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected visit. "We're good here," he muttered. "No issues." But as Mark walked through the facility, it became painfully obvious that the foreman was lying. The ventilation system was practically non-existent, forcing workers to breathe in whatever fumes lingered in the air. Machines roared incessantly, drowning out any attempt at conversation. And then there were the workers themselves, young faces among them, some barely old enough to drive, let alone operate heavy machinery. Mark's stomach churned as he spotted a group of teenagers huddled near one of the assembly lines. Their hands moved mechanically, sorting materials without gloves or masks. One boy coughed violently into his sleeve, while another wiped sweat from his brow with trembling fingers. None of them looked older than 18. His suspicions deepened when he noticed posters plastered on the walls, bold letters warning employees not to discuss work conditions outside the factory. Beneath the surface-level compliance, this place reeked of corruption. Mark snapped photos discreetly, documenting every detail he could. He needed evidence, not just for Sarah's sake, but for all the other kids trapped in this nightmare. Back at the hospital, Emily received a call from Dr. Hayes. His tone was grave as he explained his findings. "The compound in your patient's blood is called triethylene glycol methyl ether," he said. "It's commonly used in industrial solvents and paints. While it's not highly toxic in small doses, prolonged exposure can lead to serious health problems, including kidney damage, respiratory issues, and even neurological effects." Emily's heart sank. This wasn't just a random chemical, it was a known hazard strictly regulated in workplaces. Yet somehow, it had ended up in Sarah's bloodstream. "Could it cause someone to pass out?" she asked. "It's possible," Dr. Hayes replied, "especially if combined with dehydration or lack of proper nutrition. The body can only handle so much stress before shutting down." Emily thanked him and hung up, her mind racing. If Sarah had been inhaling this chemical daily at the factory, it explained her symptoms, but it also raised horrifying implications. How many others were being poisoned without realizing it? And who was responsible for allowing such unsafe conditions? She returned to Sarah's bedside, finding her awake and staring blankly at the wall. Emily pulled up a chair and spoke gently. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Do you remember smelling anything unusual at the factory? Something strong, maybe burning or chemical-like?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah. Always smelled weird. Like paint thinner or something. They told us it was normal, that we'd get used to it." Emily clenched her fists under the table, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Normal? Nothing about this was normal. She forced herself to stay composed, knowing Sarah needed reassurance more than anything else. That smell might have made you sick, Emily explained, carefully. We think it's why you passed out, but don't worry, we're going to figure this out together. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Am I gonna die? She whispered. No, Emily said firmly. You're safe now. We'll make sure. Nothing like this happens again. Later that afternoon, Mark returned to the hospital, his expression grim. He met Emily in a private consultation room, spreading out the photos he'd taken at the factory. Take a look at this, he said, pointing to images of the teenage workers. These kids are being exploited. No protective gear, no brakes, and definitely no regard for safety regulations. Emily studied the pictures, her jaw tightening with each one. This matches what Sarah described, she said quietly. And based on the chemical traces in her blood, I'd say these fumes are affecting everyone who works there. Mark nodded. I'm filing a formal complaint with OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, but we need more than just my word. Can you provide medical documentation linking Sarah's condition to the factory? Absolutely, Emily replied. I'll draft a report detailing everything we've discovered so far. With your evidence and mine, we'll have a solid case. As they strategized, Sarah listened from her bed, catching snippets of their conversation through the cracked door. For the first time since waking up, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone believed her. Maybe someone would finally put an end to the nightmare she'd endured for months. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon once more, Emily sat beside Sarah again. You've been incredibly brave, she said softly. What you've shared with us is helping expose something very wrong. Are you ready to tell us more? Sarah took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. Yes, she whispered. I want to help. In that moment, both Emily and Mark knew they were on the verge of something big. This wasn't just about saving one girl anymore. It was about dismantling a system that preyed on the vulnerable. And with Sarah's courage fueling their efforts, they were determined to see justice served. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity for both Dr. Emily Carter and Officer Mark Reynolds. Armed with mounting evidence, they worked tirelessly to piece together the full picture of what was happening at the factory. For Emily, it meant long hours analyzing Sarah's medical records, drafting reports, and consulting with environmental health experts. For Mark, it involved combing through employment records, interviewing former workers, and building a case strong enough to bring down those responsible. Sarah, meanwhile, remained in the hospital under close observation. Her condition had stabilized, but the emotional toll of her ordeal was evident. She spent most of her time staring out the window, lost in thought. Occasionally, tears would stream silently down her cheeks, and she'd pull the blanket tighter around herself as if trying to shield her fragile body from the world outside. Emily visited her daily, offering words of encouragement and gently coaxing more details about her experiences at the factory. Each conversation brought new revelations, some small, others devastating. One afternoon, while sitting beside Sarah's bed, Emily broached a sensitive topic. Sarah, she began softly, you mentioned before that you felt pressured to work long hours. Did anyone ever threaten you or make you feel like you couldn't leave? Sarah hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in the edge of the blanket. For a moment, Emily thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Sarah admitted, they said, if I didn't meet my quota, I'd lose my job. And if I told anyone about the fumes or how tired I was, they'd blacklist me. No one else would hire me. Her confession sent a chill through Emily. Blacklisting wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. These weren't isolated incidents of negligence. This was systemic exploitation designed to keep workers trapped. The more Sarah spoke, the clearer it became that the factory owners had deliberately created an environment where fear ruled over fairness. Mark's investigation took him deeper into the heart of the operation. He requested access to the factory's employee logs, cross-referencing names with local school enrollment databases. What he found shocked him. Dozens of teenagers, many still enrolled in high school, were listed as temporary workers. Some had forged parental consent forms while others claimed to be older than they actually were. When Mark confronted the factory manager, a man named Greg Lawson, the tension in the room was palpable. Lawson sat behind his desk, his face flushed, with anger as Mark laid out the evidence. "These kids are underage," Mark said firmly, slamming a folder onto the table. "You've been violating labor laws left and right, not to mention exposing them to hazardous chemicals without proper safety measures." Lawson leaned back in his chair, attempting to appear calm despite the sweat forming on his forehead. "Look, officer, we follow all regulations," he insisted. "If there are issues, it's because rogue employees cut corners without our knowledge." But Mark wasn't buying it. He pulled out photos of the factory floor, images of teenagers, working without protective gear, surrounded by visibly inadequate ventilation systems. "You expect me to believe this is some kind of oversight?" he shot back. "This isn't negligence, this is deliberate." Lawson's composure cracked slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward with a smug grin. "Prove it," he challenged. "Without hard evidence tying us directly to these violations, your claims don't hold water." Mark clenched his fists beneath the table, resisting the urge to slam them down in frustration. Lawson was right. They needed irrefutable proof. But thanks to Emily's efforts, that proof was closer than ever. Back at the hospital, Emily finalized her report linking Sarah's medical condition to prolonged exposure to triethylene glycol, methyl ether. She included detailed lab results, expert testimony from Dr. Hayes, and first-hand accounts from Sarah herself. When she handed the document to Mark, his eyes lit up with determination. "This is exactly what we need," he said, flipping through the pages. "With this, we can push OSHA to conduct an immediate inspection. And once they see what's going on inside that place, there's no way they'll let it stay open." Together, they devised a plan. Emily would remain at the hospital, ensuring Sarah's continued recovery while preparing to testify if necessary. Mark, meanwhile, would spearhead the legal battle, coordinating with local authorities and regulatory agencies to shut down the factory once and for all. As news of the investigation spread, whispers began circulating throughout Maplewood. At first, it was just rumors, a few concerned parents discussing odd smells coming from the factory, or teenagers talking about friends who had mysteriously dropped out of school to work. But soon, the story gained traction. Local reporters caught wind of the situation, digging into public records and interviewing former factory workers. One young man, barely 19, came forward with harrowing tales of forced overtime and toxic fumes. Another described collapsing during a shift, only to be sent home without pay and told not to return unless he could handle the job. The media coverage ignited outrage across the community. Parents demanded answers, holding protests outside the factory gates. Signs reading, "Protect our kids," and "Justice for workers," dotted the streets, while chants echoed through the air. The pressure mounted on factory management, forcing them to issue a public statement denying wrongdoing. "We are committed to providing safe and fair working conditions for all employees," the statement read. "Any allegations of misconduct are baseless and will be proven false." But their words rang hollow. Behind closed doors, panic set in among the factory executives. Documents were shredded, emails deleted, and incriminating evidence destroyed. Yet despite their efforts to cover their tracks, the truth was slowly coming to light. For Sarah, watching the events unfold from her hospital bed was surreal. She had always believed she was alone in her suffering, too afraid to speak up. Now seeing others come forward with similar stories filled her with a sense of solidarity and hope. For the first time in months, she felt like she mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat beside her, holding her hand. "You've started something incredible, Sarah," she said gently. "Because of you, people are finally paying attention. You're giving others the courage to speak out." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear or despair. They were tears of relief. "I just want it to stop," she whispered. "No one else should have to go through what I did." "It will stop," Emily promised. "We won't let them get away with this." Outside, the protest grew louder, fueled by the growing mountain of evidence. Inside, Sarah clung to Emily's words, drawing strength from the knowledge that she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Together, they were part of something bigger, a movement to expose the truth and demand justice for everyone affected. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, one thing was certain: change was coming. The momentum of the investigation grew stronger with each passing day. Officer Mark Reynolds worked tirelessly, coordinating with federal agencies and ensuring that every piece of evidence was meticulously documented. Dr. Emily Carter's medical report became the linchpin of the case, providing undeniable proof of the harm caused by the factory's negligence. Together, they had built a foundation strong enough to bring down the corrupt system that had exploited so many. As OSHA inspectors arrived at the factory unannounced, chaos erupted within its walls. Workers scrambled to hide any incriminating materials while managers tried desperately to maintain composure. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Inspectors found everything they needed: hazardous chemicals stored improperly, inadequate ventilation systems, and records showing blatant disregard for labor laws. Teenagers were pulled aside for interviews, their frightened faces speaking volumes about the conditions they endured. Back at the hospital, Sarah watched news reports of the raid unfold on a small television mounted in her room. Her heart raced as she saw images of protesters outside the factory gates holding signs demanding justice. For months, she had felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Now seeing others rise up against the same injustice gave her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. Dr. Emily Carter visited Sarah later that evening, bringing updates from the investigation. "They've shut it down," Emily said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "The factory is closed indefinitely until further notice." Sarah's eyes widened. "Really? It's over?" "For now," Emily replied cautiously. "But we still have a long way to go. The legal process will take time, and there's no guarantee everyone involved will face consequences. Still, this is a huge step forward." Sarah nodded, processing the information. Though relief washed over her, she couldn't shake the lingering fear that someone might retaliate. What if the factory owners came after her? What if they tried to silence her before she could testify? Emily noticed the worry etched on Sarah's face and placed a reassuring hand on hers. "You're safe here," she said firmly. "Mark, and I won't let anything happen to you. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's ours too." Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds faced resistance from unexpected quarters. Factory owner Greg Lawson hired a high-profile lawyer to defend him, claiming ignorance of the violations. Publicly, he portrayed himself as a victim of misinformation, accusing Mark and Emily of exaggerating the situation for personal gain. Behind closed doors, however, his actions told a different story. Anonymous threats began arriving at the police station, cryptic messages warning Mark to drop the case or face consequences. At first, he dismissed them as empty intimidation tactics. But when his car tires were slashed one night after leaving work, he realized the danger was real. These people weren't going down without a fight. Determined not to back down, Mark doubled his efforts. He reached out to former workers who had left the factory under suspicious circumstances, piecing together a timeline of abuses. One woman recounted being fired after complaining about unsafe conditions. Another described witnessing managers tampering with safety equipment to save costs. Each testimony added weight to their case, painting a damning picture of greed and exploitation. The media played a crucial role in keeping the pressure on. Journalists uncovered financial records showing how much money the factory saved by cutting corners, money funneled directly into executive bonuses. Stories of underage workers suffering from chronic illnesses due to chemical exposure dominated headlines, sparking outrage nationwide. Parents organized town hall meetings, demanding stricter enforcement of child labor laws. High school students staged walkouts, refusing to return to class until something was done to protect their peers. Amidst the growing scrutiny, Sarah became an unlikely symbol of resilience. Her story resonated deeply with the public, inspiring others to come forward with their own experiences. One by one, teenagers stepped into the spotlight, sharing tales of exhaustion, fear, and betrayal. Their collective voices formed a tidal wave of accountability that even the most powerful executives couldn't ignore. For Sarah, stepping into the public eye was terrifying. She had spent so long hiding her pain, afraid of what might happen if anyone found out. Now she was asked to relive it, not just for herself but for everyone else who had suffered in silence. Emily stayed by her side throughout the process, coaching her on how to handle interviews and preparing her for potential backlash. "You don't have to do this alone," Emily reminded her. "Every word you say helps shine a light on what happened. You're making a difference." Sarah took a deep breath, summoning the courage to face the cameras. When she spoke, her voice trembled at first, but soon it grew steadier. "I'm not scared anymore," she declared during one interview. "If telling my story can help stop this from happening to someone else, then it's worth it." Her words struck a chord with viewers, galvanizing support for the movement. People began donating to legal funds set up to assist victims, while volunteers offered counseling services to those struggling emotionally. The community rallied around Sarah and others like her, proving that solidarity could overcome even the darkest forces. As weeks turned into months, the legal battle intensified. Lawson and his associates fought tooth and nail to avoid responsibility, dragging the proceedings out as long as possible. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. Leaked emails revealed discussions about falsifying safety reports. Surveillance footage showed supervisors turning a blind eye to obvious hazards. And witness testimonies painted a vivid picture of systemic abuse. Finally, after months of hearings and deliberations, the verdict came down. The factory was permanently shut down, its assets seized to compensate victims. Several top executives, including Lawson, were charged with criminal negligence and conspiracy to violate labor laws. While prison sentences varied, the message was clear. Exploiting vulnerable workers would no longer be tolerated. For Sarah, the ruling brought a mix of emotions. Relief flooded through her knowing that justice had been served. But grief lingered. For all the lost opportunities, the birthdays missed, the friendships strained, the dreams deferred. Yet amidst the pain, she also felt pride. She had stood up when it mattered most, refusing to let fear dictate her future. In the aftermath, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be. Sarah returned. Home, though things were far from perfect. Her parents, initially furious about her working without permission, softened as they learned the truth. Counseling sessions helped mend fractured relationships, allowing Sarah to rebuild trust with her family. At school, she threw herself into advocacy work, joining groups dedicated to improving workplace safety and protecting young workers' rights. Her bravery inspired classmates to speak out about issues affecting their lives, creating a culture of openness and support. Officer Mark Reynolds continued serving Maplewood, forever changed by the case. It reinforced his belief in the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. As for Dr. Emily Carter, she remained steadfast in her mission to heal both bodies and minds, using Sarah's story as a reminder of why her work mattered. Together, they had exposed a dark chapter in their town's history. But more importantly, they had ignited a spark of change, a spark that would continue to burn brightly, lighting the path toward a better, fairer future for everyone. Months passed since the factory's closure, and life in Maplewood began to settle into a new rhythm. The scars of the past were still visible, empty storefronts where businesses once thrived, families struggling to rebuild after losing income, but there was also a sense of renewal. The town had come together in ways no one expected, united by a shared determination to ensure such exploitation never happened again. For Sarah, the journey toward healing was ongoing. Physically, she had recovered from the worst effects of chemical exposure, though occasional headaches and fatigue reminded her of what she'd endured. Emotionally, however, the road was longer. Therapy sessions helped her process the trauma, but some wounds ran too deep to heal quickly. Yet, despite the Lingering pain, Sarah found strength in knowing she wasn't alone. Her story had touched countless lives, inspiring others to speak out against injustice. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood at the podium in front of her high school auditorium. She had been invited to address her peers during an assembly focused on workers' rights and youth advocacy. As she looked out at the sea of faces, her heart pounded with nerves. This was the largest crowd she had ever spoken to, and the weight of their expectations felt almost unbearable. But then she remembered Emily's words. "Every word you say helps shine a light on what happened." Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to speak. "I used to think I was alone," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I thought no one would believe me if I told them how scared I was every day at that factory. But when I finally did speak up, something amazing happened. People listened, they cared, and because of that, we were able to make a difference." The room fell silent as Sarah recounted her experiences, the long hours, the toxic fumes, the constant fear of retaliation. She didn't shy away from the hardest parts, knowing that honesty was key to preventing others from suffering the same fate. When she finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause, many students rising to their feet in admiration. Afterward, several students approached her, asking how they could get involved in advocacy work. Some shared their own stories of unsafe jobs or unfair treatment, seeking advice on how to handle similar situations. For Sarah, these conversations were bittersweet. While it saddened her to know others faced similar struggles, she took solace in being able to guide them toward resources and support. Officer Mark Reynolds watched the news coverage of Sarah's speech with pride. He had always believed in the power of community action, but seeing it unfold firsthand reinforced his faith in humanity. The case had changed him too. It had reminded him why he became a police officer, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and reignited his passion for justice. Mark continued working closely with local authorities to strengthen labor laws and improve workplace inspections. His efforts earned him recognition within the department, but more importantly, they sparked meaningful change across the region. Factories once notorious for cutting corners now faced stricter oversight, and employers grew wary of violating regulations. Still, Mark knew the fight wasn't over. Exploitation existed in many forms, often hidden behind closed doors. Determined to stay vigilant, he partnered with schools and community organizations to educate young people about their rights as workers. Workshops taught students how to identify unsafe conditions and report violations without fear of retaliation. These initiatives gave Mark hope, not just for Maplewood, but for future generations everywhere. Dr. Emily Carter returned to her routine at St. Mary's Hospital, though her perspective had shifted profoundly. Treating patients was no longer just about diagnosing illnesses. It was about understanding the broader context of their suffering. Every bruise, every lab result carried a story waiting to be uncovered, a chance to advocate for someone in need. Emily kept in touch with Sarah, checking in regularly to monitor her progress. Over time, their relationship evolved from doctor-patient to mentor-mentee. Emily encouraged Sarah to pursue her dream of becoming an advocate for workers' rights, even helping her apply for scholarships and internships in public policy. Watching Sarah grow into a confident, determined young woman filled Emily with immense pride. At the hospital, Emily spearheaded new protocols for identifying signs of workplace abuse. She collaborated with social workers and legal experts to create a support network for victims, ensuring they received not only medical care but also guidance through the legal system. Her work inspired colleagues to adopt similar measures, spreading awareness far beyond Maplewood's borders. As winter approached, the town prepared for its annual holiday festival. This year, organizers decided to dedicate the event to raising funds for victims of workplace exploitation. Booths lined Main Street selling handmade crafts and baked goods, while local bands performed on a makeshift stage. At the center of it all stood a memorial wall, adorned with names and photos of those affected by the factory scandal. Sarah attended the festival with her family, marveling at how much things had changed since the night she collapsed in front of Officer Reynolds. Back then, she had felt invisible, like her struggles didn't matter. Now, surrounded by loved ones and strangers alike, She realized just how wrong she had been. Her voice mattered. It always had. Later that evening, as fireworks lit up the sky, Sarah stood beside Emily and Mark, watching the colorful bursts reflect off the snow-covered rooftops. "Do you think we made a real difference?" she asked quietly. Emily smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Absolutely. Look around you. This whole town is proof of that." Mark nodded in agreement. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you, people brave enough to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' You've inspired so many others to do the same." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for the community that rallied around her, for the friends who supported her, and for the courage she discovered within herself. In the years that followed, Sarah's story became part of Maplewood's history. Textbooks included chapters about the factory scandal, teaching students about the importance of standing up against injustice. Laws tightened, protecting workers of all ages from exploitation. And though challenges remained, the town emerged, stronger, more united than ever before. For Sarah, Mark, and Emily, the experience left an indelible mark. They had faced darkness head-on, refusing to let it consume them. Together, they proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resilience and compassion could spark transformative change. And as Sarah walked away from the festival that night, wrapped in the warmth of her family and friends, she knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone willing to carry the torch forward.